Welcome to this episode of the Canada History Society's series on British Columbia Confederation. In this 8th episode of the Canada History Society's 20-part series, we look at the option to remain a colony or an independent state. It was a curious quirk of history that empires so often birth nations in their twilight, and that distant provinces sometimes dream of standing alone. In the rough hinterland of mid-19th century British Columbia, as the gold fever cooled and colonial debts rose like the tide, the dream of independence flickered briefly, and then was buried beneath geography, demography, and the grim arithmetic of imperial neglect. Between 1866 and 1871, as the colonies of Vancouver Island and British Columbia debated their future, the question of whether to remain a colony, join the young Dominion of Canada, or strike out as an independent country was not merely rhetorical, it was existential. The question did not emerge in a vacuum. By the mid-1860s, both colonies, Vancouver Island with its maritime civility and British pretensions, and mainland British Columbia, bruised by the chaotic rush of miners and the collapse of the Cariboo Gold Rush, were exhausted. The great gold-led expansion had sputtered, fortunes dried up, roads paid for on credit twisted through ghost towns. The colonial governments, especially that of British Columbia, were deeply in debt. The Royal Navy was drawing down. Britain's appetite for subsidizing remote outposts had grown thin. The imperial romance was fading into colonial fatigue. It was in this interregnum, this brittle pause between boom and confederation, that a genuine discussion of independence took root. The idea of remaining a self-governing colony, or even a Pacific Republic of sorts, found champions among the colonial elite, writes Jean Barman, in the West beyond the West. Some saw British Columbia not as a peripheral fragment, but as a Pacific crossroads, a place with commercial ties to San Francisco, China, Australia, and beyond. In Victoria's merchant houses and saloons, as well as in the occasional editorial pages of the British colonist newspaper, the notion of independence flickered, vague but seductive. Among those who entertained the idea were men like Armand de Cosmo, the eccentric yet articulate editor of the British Colonist, who would later become a tireless Confederationist. But before this conversion, even de Cosmo had mused about what a Pacific Dominion might mean, a colony unshackled from London's indifference and Ottawa's ambitions. Why should we trade Victoria's destiny for dependency upon an Eastern Confederation we do not know, under a parliament we cannot reach? He once asked in print, framing the geographical anxiety shared by many. The sense of isolation from the Canadian East was profound. The Rockies were more than a mountain range. They were a chasm.
Well, the objects of the British Columbia delegation that went to Ottawa were many and very demanding. They wanted a continuous communication with the rest of the Dominion, and they came away with a better promise of a railway. What would be the benefits to Canada for having British Columbia? Well, they would have a port on the Pacific. They would have the chance of building a railway to the Pacific. They would have a connection with the commerce of the Pacific through a burgeoning cities that would develop. There was coal out here in Nanaimo. There was the naval base at Esquimalt. There was the growing commerce of the North Pacific. So all of these things were going to be a benefit. But there were other things that had to be managed as well. What was to be the size of the population? Because they were asking for a per capita assessment in order to write down their debt. And here I'm speaking about males and persons who had naturalized citizenship in British Columbia. The indigenous people and the Chinese and others were not entered into this body politic that I'm talking about. So it was a select group that we're talking about here. The objects of getting access to the rich mining, fishing, and forestry capacities of British Columbia was a really important matter. And presumably a free trade arrangement would be entered into between British Columbia and the rest of Canada. And so there were great commercial prospects here as well.
Others, particularly among the merchant class, saw practical advantages. An independent British Columbia, tied to Pacific trade, could flourish, some believed, as a hub of shipping, timber, and mining. American entrepreneurs in San Francisco were eager for partnerships. Indeed, one powerful faction believed annexation by the United States might be preferable to becoming a marginal province in Canada. Alfred Waddington, an entrepreneur and transportation promoter, had envisioned trade routes linking British Columbia directly to California and Asia, bypassing the British imperial economy entirely. The colony, he argued, could stand as a new kind of Pacific state, self-reliant and commercially agile. The dreams of independence, like masts without ships, faltered when faced with realities. British Columbia in the 1860s was not a nation. It was barely a functioning colony. The population of the mainland colony in 1867 stood at fewer than 10,000 Europeans, with tens of thousands of indigenous inhabitants excluded from any political consideration. The union of the two colonies in 1866, Vancouver Island and British Columbia, had been an act of desperation, not unity. Colonial revenues were evaporating. Infrastructure, such as the Cariboo Road, had bankrupted the treasury. The Hudson Bay Company no longer held monopolistic sway, and the British government was increasingly reluctant to extend financial lifelines. Margaret Ormsby, in her definitive British Columbia A History, wrote that the independence idea was more rhetorical than real, a ghost of a possibility that could not find the material support to become flesh. The obstacles were manifold. There was no army, no navy, no foreign service, no railway to tie the coast to a continent. An independent colony would require the kind of administrative apparatus, defense budget, and diplomatic standing that neither colony possessed nor could afford. Opposition to independence came not only from Ottawa, but also from within. Governor Frederick Seymour, who served British Columbia until his untimely death in 1869, was staunchly against both independence and Confederation, but for different reasons. Seymour viewed the notion of a Pacific Dominion as fanciful and doomed. British Columbia is not ripe for nationhood, he wrote to London in 1865, and would be consumed by her own ambitions should she try. His successor, Anthony Musgrave, was more pragmatic and more in step with Ottawa. Tasked by the Colonial Office with preparing the colony for Confederation, Musgrave became its quiet architect, working behind the scenes to bring hesitant colonial elites into the fold by promising debt relief and a transcontinental railway. Economic and strategic logic began to drown out the dreams. The United States, having just emerged from civil war, loomed with expansionistic ambition. The acquisition of Alaska in 1867 signaled a new northern appetite. British Columbia's elites began to fear isolation more than integration. The American flag could as easily fly over Victoria as it did over Sitka, warned one editorial in 1868. Historian Donald Creighton put it bluntly: the colony's destiny was being decided by pressures far beyond its borders. The choice was not between independence and Confederation, but between Canada and absorption.
In the background of this was the British government, which is pressing for an all-red route that would come to Halifax, then through Montreal, then by rail, when once built, to Vancouver, an E&N railway perhaps to Victoria, and then on to the fabled cities and the commerce of Hong Kong, Yokohama, and so forth. So these were important connections. The rest of Canada was landlocked, and it was eastern oriented, but this was going to be a new westward vision for a transcontinental Canada, and that I think is a very, very important benefit that would come to the Canadians.
The clinching argument, the one that finally buried the idea of independence, was the promise of a railway. In exchange for joining Confederation, Ottawa pledged to build a transcontinental rail line within 10 years. This promise was monumental. For a colony beset by mountains, snow, and salt water, the railway offered a vision of belonging. It was, as Creighton observed, a steel lifeline to the heart of a new nation. For the young politicians who would come to dominate British Columbia's entry into Canada, John Helmeken, Joseph Trutch, and to Cosmos himself, the promise of a Canadian Pacific Railway became not just policy, but prophecy. And yet the dream of independence never fully vanished. It reemerged later in new forms: regionalism, Western alienation, Pacific nationalism. But in the crucible of the 1860s, it was a dream too soon, and for a colony too fragile. As the Union Jack and Red Ensign fluttered together in Victoria on July 20th, 1871, there were no declarations of Pacific sovereignty, no founding documents of a new nation. There was only one ceremony: compromise and the quiet surrender of a colonial dream in favor of a national one. In the final estimation, British Columbia did not become a country of its own, not because its people lacked ambition, but because they lacked the means. Independence, like gold, is a seductive glint, but in the end, it must be mined, minted, and defended. And in the British Columbia of the 1860s, that was a cost few could afford to pay. Join us next time for Part 8 of the Canada History Society's 20-part series as we explore annexation to the U.S.